April 17, 1945, Remscheid, Germany. A cold spring rain fell on the bomb-damaged rooftops as Frau Helga Schmidt clutched her 8-year-old daughter's hand tighter. Through the broken window of her apartment, she could see the first American tanks entering the town. She felt both relief and terror. For weeks, propaganda leaflets had warned of the horrors that would follow. "The Black Devils will chain you," the pamphlets declared. "They will take everything." The Wehrmacht officers had been specific about the dangers posed by the Negro troops among the Americans. Now, as Helga peered through the curtains, she saw them, tall black soldiers dismounting from vehicles at the end of her street. What happened in the following days would shatter everything she had been told to believe. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how Nazi propaganda collided with American reality, and how the descendants of slaves showed unexpected humanity to the citizens of the Third Reich. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days as the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion pushed eastward through the German countryside. First Lieutenant James Wilson had grown accustomed to the perpetual moisture, the constant squelch of mud beneath his boots, and the smell of wet wool that seemed to permeate everything. The battalion, part of the all-black 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers, had been in almost continuous combat since October 1944. 6 months of fighting across France, Belgium, and now Germany itself had hardened the men, though not in the way Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels had described in his vicious broadcasts. "Check your weapons and equipment again," Wilson called to his platoon as their vehicles approached Remscheid. "We're entering the town in 15 minutes. Staff Sergeant Thomas Jefferson Brown, a tall man from Oklahoma, whose grandfather had been born into slavery, methodically inspected his M1 Garand rifle. At 26, Brown had already lived several lives: ranch hand, rodeo rider, and now tank destroyer crewman. His hands, once calloused from rope and saddle, now bore the marks of steel and gunpowder. "What do you think we'll find in there, Lieutenant?" Brown asked, gesturing toward the town's church spire, visible through the drizzle. "Same as always, Brown. Scared people who've been told we're monsters," Wilson replied, his voice low enough that only Brown could hear him. "Remember what happened in Darmstadt last week?" Brown nodded grimly. In Darmstadt, they'd found pamphlets depicting black American soldiers as ape-like creatures with chains and whips, standing over cowering German women. The crude illustrations were accompanied by text warning that Negro soldiers will enslave your daughters and contaminate your bloodline. The psychological warfare had been effective. Many civilians had fled before their arrival, leaving the town nearly deserted. Corporal Marcus Washington, the youngest member of Wilson's platoon at just 19, approached them with a radio message. "Sir, headquarters says to secure the town hall and establish a command post. The rest of the battalion will be here within 2 hours." Washington, a slender young man from Harlem, with a quick smile that had grown rarer with each passing month, had joined the army straight out of high school. Unlike Brown, who had grown up breaking horses in Oklahoma, Washington had never even seen a horse until basic training. The irony that they were now part of an armored cavalry unit wasn't lost on either of them. "Tell the men we're moving in 5, Wilson ordered. As the convoy of tank destroyers and support vehicles rumbled into Remscheid, the soldiers were met with empty streets. Occasionally, curtains would flutter as hidden eyes watched their progress. The psychological operations of the Wehrmacht had been comprehensive. Since 1944, German civilians had been fed a steady diet of propaganda about the supposed savagery of black American troops. Wehrmacht Captain Klaus Müller had personally overseen the distribution of such materials in Remscheid just 3 weeks earlier. A decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, Müller had been reassigned to propaganda duties after losing his left leg below the knee during the Battle of Kursk. Though he considered the assignment beneath him, Müller had embraced his new role with characteristic German efficiency. "They must fear the Americans more than they fear us," Müller had told Mayor Friedrich Weber as they stood in the town hall. "Especially the black ones. The women must hide. The children must be protected. Tell them that Negro troops have been promised German women as rewards for their service." Weber, a pragmatic man who had joined the Nazi Party more out of necessity than conviction, had nodded obediently while privately harboring doubts. He had studied in America briefly before the war and knew that the crude caricatures in Muller's pamphlets bore little resemblance to the black Americans he had met in Chicago in 1935. But questioning Muller would have been dangerous, especially with Gestapo officer Werner Kleinmann standing silently in the corner, watching every flicker of expression on Weber's face. Now, as American tanks entered his town, Weber sat alone in his office, a half-empty bottle of schnapps on his desk and a Walter P-38 pistol beside it. The choice before him seemed stark: face possible execution by the Americans for his party membership, or use the pistol and end things on his own terms. Müller and Kleinmann had fled 2 days earlier, taking the last functioning military vehicles and leaving the townspeople to their fate. Meanwhile, Helga Schmidt was trying to decide whether to remain hidden or to risk approaching the Americans. Her pantry was nearly empty, and her daughter Greta's persistent cough needed medicine. The municipal pharmacy had been closed for a week, ever since the pharmacist had joined the last-ditch Volkssturm militia. Rumors said he had been killed during an American air raid on the outskirts of town. "Mutti, I'm hungry," Greta whispered, her blue eyes wide with a combination of fear and childish curiosity, as she peeked through the curtains at the American vehicles. "I know, Liebchen," Helga answered, stroking her daughter's blonde hair. "We must be patient a little longer." Helga's husband, Otto, had been drafted into the Wehrmacht in 1943 and sent to the Russian front. His last letter had arrived 3 months ago, describing terrible cold and constant Soviet attacks. Since then, silence. She didn't know if he was alive or dead, a prisoner or a casualty. Like so many German women, Helga had been forced to become both mother and father, provider and protector. The propaganda leaflets about the black American soldiers lay in her fireplace, half-burned. She had read them, been frightened by them, but something in their crude depictions and hysterical warnings had struck her as false. Still, doubt lingered. What if they were true? A sharp knock at her door made her jump. Greta clutched her mother's skirt, eyes wide with fear. "Frau Schmidt, are you there? It's Frau Müller from downstairs." Helga relaxed slightly, opening the door to admit her elderly neighbor, a widow whose sons had both died at Stalingrad. "The Americans are setting up some kind of food distribution at the town square," Frau Müller whispered urgently. "They have chocolate and canned meat." "Frau Becker already went," she said. The old woman hesitated. "Said what?" Helga prompted. "She said the Negro soldiers gave her children extra rations and that no one harmed her." Frau Müller looked confused, as if the reality she had just described contradicted everything she had been led to expect. In the town square, Lieutenant Wilson had indeed established a food distribution point. Standard procedure for the 614th when entering German towns was to immediately demonstrate goodwill by sharing rations with civilians, especially children. It was partly humanitarian and partly tactical. Hungry civilians were unpredictable, while fed ones were usually cooperative. "Make sure the kids get the chocolate first," Wilson instructed Corporal Washington, who was organizing crates of K-rations and supplementary supplies. "And tell Perkins to set up the medical station next to the church. There are bound to be sick people here." Staff Sergeant Brown was tasked with building a rapport with any local officials who might emerge. His natural calm and the measured drawl of his Oklahoma accent often put nervous Europeans at ease, despite initial fears based on his appearance. "Lieutenant, I think I've found the mayor," Brown called as a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit cautiously approached from the direction of the town hall. Friedrich Weber had ultimately decided against using his pistol, choosing instead to face whatever came with as much dignity as he could muster. "Ich bin der Bürgermeister," Weber announced, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil. "I am the mayor." "Sir," Brown addressed Wilson, "he says he's the mayor." Wilson approached Weber, noticing the Nazi party pin that the German had forgotten to remove from his lapel. The American officer's expression hardened slightly. "Tell him we need his cooperation to maintain order and distribute supplies," Wilson said to Private Heinrich Steiner, their German-American interpreter. "And tell him that pin on his jacket isn't doing him any favors." Weber paled as Steiner translated, hastily removing the pin and pocketing it. I had no choice, he said in English, surprising the Americans. I was professor of engineering before the war. To keep my position, I had to join. Wilson's expression remained neutral. He had heard similar explanations in every German town they had liberated. Sometimes they were true, sometimes not. It wasn't his job to judge. Military intelligence officers would handle the denazification interviews later. We need a list of residents, especially those with medical needs, Wilson said directly to Weber in English, and we need to know if there are any Wehrmacht or SS stragglers hiding in town. Weber swallowed hard at the mention of SS. The last soldiers left 2 days ago, Captain Müller from Wehrmacht propaganda and Officer Kleinmann from, he hesitated, from State Security. Gestapo, Steiner translated the euphemism flatly. Weber nodded uncomfortably. They took vehicles and left. They told us the black American soldiers would... He trailed off, unwilling to repeat the vicious claims. Would what? Brown asked, his deep voice betraying no emotion. Weber looked at the ground. They said you would chain our women and children, that you were savages who had been promised German women as... He couldn't finish the sentence. A tense silence fell over the group. Wilson exchanged glances with Brown, both men all too familiar with the propaganda used against them. It was the same dehumanizing rhetoric they had faced back home in America, just adapted for wartime purposes. Mayor Weber, Wilson finally said, his voice controlled, I suggest you look around at what my men are actually doing, then reconsider what you've been told. As if to underscore his point, a small commotion broke out nearby. Corporal Washington was kneeling beside a crying German boy of about 7 who had dropped his chocolate ration in the mud. Washington was unwrapping a fresh chocolate bar from his own personal supply, smiling as he handed it to the wide-eyed child. Weber watched this interaction, his academic's mind processing the disconnect between the propaganda and the reality before him. I see, he said quietly. By mid-afternoon, word had spread through Remscheid that the Americans were distributing food and medicine. The town square filled with cautious residents, primarily women, children, and the elderly. The fighting-age men were mostly gone, dead, imprisoned, or still with what remained of the German military. Combat medic James Doc Perkins, a black soldier whose father and grandfather had both been physicians in Virginia, had set up an impromptu clinic beside the Gothic church. He was currently examining Greta Schmidt's chest with a stethoscope while Helga watched anxiously. Your daughter has bronchitis, Ma'am, Perkins told her through Steiner's translation. Not pneumonia, which is good news. I can give you some sulfadiazine for her. He reached into his medical bag and produced a bottle of pills, explaining the dosage through the interpreter. Danke, Helga said, looking directly at Perkins rather than at Steiner. Then, hesitantly, in halting English, Thank you, Doctor. Perkins smiled. I'm not a doctor yet, Ma'am. Going to medical school when I get home, though. When this was translated, Helga looked surprised. The idea that a black man could become a physician contradicted everything the Nazi educational system had taught about racial hierarchies. It was the first of many contradictions she would encounter in the coming days. Meanwhile, Staff Sergeant Brown had discovered something of personal interest, a small stable behind the town brewery, where 3 nervous horses remained. The animals were thin, but otherwise in good condition, clearly well cared for despite food shortages. Brown approached the elderly man who appeared to be tending them. These your horses? Brown asked, forgetting momentarily that the German probably wouldn't understand him. The old man stared at Brown with initial apprehension that slowly gave way to curiosity as he watched the black soldier expertly approach the nearest horse, a dappled grey mare. Brown moved with the natural confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime around such animals, holding out his hand palm down for the horse to sniff. Sie mögen Pferde? The old man finally asked. Private Steiner, who had followed Brown, translated, He's asking if you like horses. Brown nodded, stroking the mare's neck. Tell him I worked with horses my whole life before the war. My family has a small ranch in Oklahoma. When this was translated, the old German's face lit up with surprise and interest. Sagt ist ein Cowboy, he exclaimed. Steiner laughed. He says you're a cowboy. Brown smiled for what felt like the first time in weeks. I suppose I am, at that. The old man introduced himself as Hans Becker, the brewery's stableman. Through Steiner's translation, he explained that the horses had belonged to the brewery for delivering beer barrels, but with production stopped and gasoline unavailable, they had become essential for all types of transportation in town. Becker had hidden the horses when the retreating Wehrmacht tried to requisition them. "Brave man," Brown commented when he heard this. They could have shot him for that. As they spoke, a small crowd of children had gathered at the stable door, watching with undisguised fascination as the black American soldier communicated so easily with the nervous horses. For many of them, it was their first time seeing a black person outside of propaganda posters, and the disconnect between the gentleman before them and the monstrous caricatures was profound. "Ist wirklich ein Teufel?" one small boy asked his friend in a whisper that carried. Steiner's face tightened as he translated for Brown. "He's asking if you're really a devil." Brown looked at the children for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small harmonica. Without a word, he began to play a gentle melodic tune, "Home on the Range." The children's eyes widened, and the horses pricked their ears forward. When he finished, Brown nodded to Steiner. "Tell them I'm just a man from far away who misses his home and his horses, same as anyone would." As Steiner translated, Brown noticed a blonde girl at the back of the group, Greta Schmidt, who was watching him with particular intensity. She was clutching a piece of paper that appeared to be one of the propaganda leaflets. When she realized he had noticed her, she quickly hid it behind her back, her face flushing with shame. Brown pretended not to notice, turning his attention back to the horses. "These animals need better feed," he told Becker through Steiner. "I'll see what we can spare from our supplies." That evening, Lieutenant Wilson established headquarters in the town hall, appropriating Mayor Weber's office for military use. Weber himself proved increasingly cooperative, providing detailed information about the town's resources, infrastructure, and the locations where retreating German forces had laid mines or booby traps. "The bridge over the river was prepared for demolition," Weber explained, pointing to a map. "But they left in such haste I don't believe they detonated the charges. Wilson dispatched an engineering team to secure the bridge immediately. If Weber was telling the truth, it would save lives and accelerate their advance. If he was lying to lead them into a trap, well, the engineers were trained to detect such things." "Mayor," Wilson said as their meeting concluded, "my men will be in Remscheid for at least a week while the rest of the division moves forward. I expect your full cooperation in maintaining order." "Of course, Lieutenant," Weber replied. He hesitated, then added, "May I speak frankly?" Wilson nodded. "Our people have been taught many things about Americans especially." Weber struggled to find a diplomatic phrasing. "Black Americans," Wilson supplied evenly. Weber nodded uncomfortably. "Yes, what we were told and what I am seeing are very different. It is confusing for many." Wilson studied the German thoughtfully. "Propaganda works by dehumanizing the enemy, Mayor Weber. Your side did it to us, and I won't pretend our side didn't do it to you. The difference is we're here now, and people can see the truth for themselves." As darkness fell over Remscheid, the American soldiers established security perimeters and posted guards. Though the town appeared secure, the war was far from over, and scattered German units were still capable of mounting counterattacks. The men of the 614th remained vigilant, even as they tried to make the war-weary civilians feel safe. Corporal Washington was assigned to guard duty near the stable where Brown had found the horses. As he patrolled the perimeter, his thoughts drifted to Harlem and his family's small apartment on 135th Street. His father worked as a porter on the railroads, and his mother cleaned houses for wealthy white families on the Upper East Side. They had been so proud when he enlisted, seeing it as a path to respect and advancement, despite the Army's segregated nature. "One day they'll have to acknowledge what we did here," his father had said. "They can't ignore it forever." Washington's reflections were interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps. He raised his rifle, then lowered it as he recognized Helga Schmidt carrying a covered dish. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly in accented English. "This is for you and your men. It is not much, just potato soup." Washington was momentarily taken aback. They had been warned not to accept food from civilians. There had been isolated cases of poisoning attempts in other towns, but the straightforward, almost apologetic expression on Helga's face suggested no malice. "Thank you, ma'am." "That's very kind," he said, maintaining a polite distance, "but I'm not sure if I can accept it." Helga seemed to understand his hesitation. "Please, my daughter Greta is feeling better because of your doctor. I want to say thank you." She held out the dish. "I will taste it first if you are worried." Washington was moved by the gesture, but still cautious. "Let me get my lieutenant to decide." "Ma'am, please wait here." He returned shortly with Lieutenant Wilson, who spoke briefly with Helga and then accepted the soup with thanks. After she left, Wilson had their cook test the soup before allowing it to be distributed. It proved to be exactly what it appeared, a simple potato soup made from their limited rations, shared as an act of gratitude. "First time that's happened," Washington commented as they ate. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Won't be the last. People respond to how they're treated, not how they're told they'll be treated." Later that night, Wilson wrote in his personal journal, a habit he had maintained throughout the campaign, April 17, 1945, Remscheid, Germany. Entered town today expecting the usual hostility, but something different is happening here. The propaganda against us was particularly vicious, but it's crumbling faster than usual upon contact with reality. Sergeant Brown has made friends with the local stable master. No surprise given his background. His natural way with horses is creating quite an impression on the local children. CPL. Washington received food from a German woman whose daughter our medic treated. The gesture was unexpected but welcome. Mayer seems cooperative, though his Nazi party membership will have to be investigated by intelligence officers. The men remain professional despite everything they've endured. I continue to marvel at their resilience in the face of both enemy fire and the constant burden of representation. Each of us knows we're not just soldiers, we're ambassadors for our race, whether we asked for that responsibility or not. Curious to see how things develop here over the next few days. The war is clearly in its final stages, though fighting remains fierce to the east. The men sense the end is coming, and are both eager and apprehensive about what peace will bring. Will America acknowledge what they've done here, or will they return to the same restrictions and prejudices they left behind? The next morning brought clearer skies, and the first real sunshine in days. The improved weather elevated everyone's spirits, and allowed the Americans to conduct a more thorough assessment of the town. Engineer teams checked buildings for structural safety, identified unexploded ordnance, and began planning repairs to critical infrastructure. Staff Sergeant Brown returned to the stable, bringing with him some grain and hay from the battalion's supplies for the horses. He found Hans Becker already at work, brushing the animals and clearing their stalls. "Guten Morgen," Brown offered, one of the few German phrases he had picked up. Becker's weathered face broke into a smile. "Guten Morgen, cowboy," he responded. Through hand gestures and their shared understanding of horses, the two men communicated more effectively than many who spoke the same language. Brown helped Becker with the morning care routine, demonstrating a few different brushing techniques that his father had taught him. As they worked, Becker produced an old, dog-eared photograph from his pocket and showed it to Brown. It depicted a much younger Becker in riding clothes standing beside a magnificent Trakehner stallion. "Ich war Reitlehrer," Becker said, pointing to himself and then miming riding posture. Brown nodded in understanding. Becker had been a riding instructor before the war. This explained his expert handling of the horses. Brown responded by pulling out his own worn photograph, showing himself astride a bucking bronco at a rodeo in 1939, his last competition before enlisting. Becker's eyes widened with appreciation, and he mimed the motion of bucking while making a questioning face. Brown grinned and nodded, then pointed to his shoulder and winced, indicating he'd been injured in the fall. Their nonverbal exchange was interrupted when Helga Schmidt arrived with Greta. The girl's condition had improved overnight thanks to Doc Perkins' medicine, and her eyes lit up at the sight of the horses. "Mutti says I can ask if I may pet the horses," Greta said in German, looking anxiously between her mother and the black soldier. When Becker translated the request, Brown nodded immediately and led the dappled mare over to where Greta stood. He demonstrated how to hold her hand flat with a small piece of carrot on the palm, allowing the horse to take it gently with its lips. Greta's initial nervousness gave way to delight as the mare nuzzled her hand and she giggled, a sound Helga realized she hadn't heard in months. "Herr Braun," Helga began tentatively after Steiner arrived to translate, "my daughter has never ridden a horse. Is it possible?" Braun looked to Becker, who nodded his approval. "Tell her it would be my pleasure to give the little lady her first riding lesson," Braun said to Steiner. "If that's all right with Herr Becker, of course." When this was translated, Becker clapped Braun on the shoulder with unexpected familiarity. "Ja, gut. Der Cowboy ist ein guter Lehrer." And so began an impromptu riding lesson. Braun carefully helped Greta mount the gentle mare, showing her how to hold the reins and sit properly. Helga watched with a mixture of anxiety and wonder as her daughter, seated high on the horse's back, was led around the stable yard by the tall black American soldier who had been described in propaganda as a devil, but who showed nothing but patience and kindness. News of the riding lesson spread quickly through the town. Within an hour, a small crowd of children and their mothers had gathered to watch. Most had never seen anyone ride a horse before. Gasoline shortages had made horse-drawn transportation necessary during the war, but recreational riding had been a luxury few could afford. Lieutenant Wilson arrived to check on Braun and found himself watching the scene with a complex mix of emotions. The sight of German children, many still wearing the remnants of Hitler Youth uniforms, now eagerly awaiting turns to be helped onto horseback by a black American soldier, seemed almost surreal. "Permission to continue, sir?" Braun asked when he noticed Wilson. "Carry on, Sergeant," Wilson replied with the ghost of a smile. "Seems like you're doing more for German-American relations than the entire diplomatic corps." By noon, at least a dozen children had received brief riding lessons. Braun had enlisted the help of Private Leon Johnson, another soldier from his platoon who had grown up on a farm in Georgia and was equally comfortable with horses. Together, they assisted each child in mounting and dismounting safely, showing them basic posture and how to communicate with the animals. The mothers watched with initial trepidation that gradually transformed into genuine appreciation. Many had never interacted with black people before, their understanding shaped entirely by Nazi racial teachings and propaganda. The contrast between what they had been told and what they were witnessing created cognitive dissonance that was rapidly resolving in favor of reality. Corporal Washington, off-duty and curious about the gathering crowd, came to observe. Unlike Braun and Johnson, he had no experience with horses, having grown up in a densely urban environment. "I thought cowboys were just in movies," Washington commented as he watched Braun help a small boy dismount. Braun laughed. "Where do you think they got the idea, city boy? My granddaddy was driving cattle when yours was still reading about it." Their easy camaraderie, visible to the German onlookers, further contradicted the propaganda narratives. According to Goebbels' material, black American soldiers were supposedly kept in chains when not fighting, treated as subhumans by their white commanders. Yet here was an obviously respected black sergeant bantering comfortably with his fellow soldiers, giving orders that were followed without question. Mayor Weber arrived at the stable around mid-afternoon, accompanied by Private Steiner and several town officials. The impromptu riding demonstration had not been officially approved, and Weber was concerned about potential safety issues and liability. "Lieutenant Wilson," Weber began formally, "while we appreciate Sergeant Braun's kindness to our children, I must inquire whether this activity has been authorized by your command." Wilson understood the subtext. Weber was protecting himself in case of complaints or injuries. "Mayor, we're helping your community reconnect with some normalcy after years of war. Unless you have specific objections, I see no reason to stop something that's bringing a little happiness to these kids." Weber seemed conflicted. "It is not that I object personally, Lieutenant. It's just that—" He lowered his voice. "Some parents have expressed concerns about their children being so close to—" He didn't finish the sentence. Wilson's expression hardened. "To black soldiers. Is that what you're trying to say, Mayor?" Weber had the decency to look embarrassed. "There are still misconceptions, Lieutenant. The propaganda was very thorough." Wilson considered his response carefully. "Those misconceptions are being corrected right now, Mayor. Look around you. See any chains, any savagery, Or do you see American soldiers showing kindness to German children despite everything your country put them through? Despite the way your propaganda painted them as animals? Weber had no immediate reply. If anyone has specific complaints, Wilson continued, they can bring them to me directly. Until then, this community engagement continues with my full authorization. As Weber departed, visibly chastened, Doc Perkins approached Wilson. Lieutenant, Frau Schmidt told me there's an orphanage on the edge of town. About 30 kids, most of them evacuees from Berlin and the Ruhr. They've been short on food and medicine for months. Wilson frowned. Why didn't Weber mention this? Apparently it's run by a Protestant deaconess who had troubles with the Nazi authorities. Not a priority for the mayor, I guess. Wilson made an immediate decision. Washington, find Steiner and get a jeep. We're going to check on these kids. Perkins, grab your medical kit and whatever supplies we can spare. The orphanage was housed in a former school building about a mile from the town center. The 3-story stone structure showed minor damage from artillery, with several windows boarded up and part of the roof missing at one end. A middle-aged woman in a simple gray dress and white head covering stood anxiously at the entrance as the American jeep approached. Guten Tag. Wilson greeted her through Steiner. We're here to help. Our medic would like to check on the children. Sister Margareta Hoffman regarded them warily at first, but her expression softened when she understood their purpose. The children are inside. Some are sick. We have little medicine, less food. The conditions inside were Spartan but clean, a testament to Sister Margaret's dedication despite minimal resources. 32 children, ranging from infants to teenagers, occupied the building, sleeping on simple cots arranged in former classrooms. Many showed signs of malnutrition, hollow cheeks, dull hair, and the too thin limbs that had become common throughout Europe. Doc Perkins immediately began examining the sickest children, while Washington and Steiner took inventory of the orphanage's supplies. Wilson spoke at length with Sister Margaret, learning that she had sheltered several Jewish children by claiming they were bombing victims from Hamburg with lost documentation. The Gestapo officer Kleinmann he suspected, she explained. He came often to inspect, to question. Always I feared he would take them. These children, Wilson asked carefully, are they still here? Sister Margaret nodded. 3, the others. Their parents found them, or relatives. These 3 have no one left. Wilson felt a surge of respect for this unassuming woman who had risked her life to protect children deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Sister, we'll make sure you receive regular supplies from our battalion, medicine, food, whatever you need most urgently. When this was translated, tears welled in the woman's eyes. Danke, she said simply, then added in halting English, God sees what you do. Back at headquarters that evening, Wilson arranged for substantial supplies to be diverted to the orphanage and assigned a rotation of soldiers to help with repairs to the damaged roof and windows. The men of the 614th, many of whom came from communities that had faced discrimination and hardship in America, responded with enthusiasm to the opportunity to help the most vulnerable victims of the war. Captain Howard Mills, Wilson's commanding officer, arrived in Remscheid that night to check on the battalion's forward position. He found Wilson in the mayor's office, surrounded by maps and requisition forms. Report, Lieutenant, Mills said briskly. Wilson stood and saluted. Town secure, sir. No enemy contact in 36 hours. Infrastructure assessment complete. And we've established good working relationships with local officials. Mills nodded, returning the salute. I've been hearing some unusual reports. Something about cowboys and horses? Wilson couldn't suppress a small smile. Staff Sergeant Brown has been putting his civilian skills to good use, sir. It's been effective for community relations. Mills raised an eyebrow. Community relations wasn't in your orders, Wilson. No, sir, but a cooperative civilian population makes our job easier and safer. Mills considered this. And this orphanage I'm hearing about? Humanitarian necessity, sir. 32 children, inadequate supplies, some in need of medical attention. Providing assistance improves our standing with the local population and aligns with division policy on civilian relief. Mills studied the younger officer thoughtfully. In the 6 months they had worked together, He had come to respect Wilson's judgment and initiative. The lieutenant consistently found practical solutions that fulfilled their military objectives while minimizing unnecessary hardship. "Very well, Wilson. Keep it up, but don't lose sight of our primary mission. The war isn't over yet." "Understood, sir." After Mills departed, Wilson returned to the paperwork before him. The 614th was responsible not only for security, but also for basic governance, until military government teams arrived. That meant everything from ensuring water purification to establishing fair food distribution to investigating potential war crimes. Meanwhile, across town, Staff Sergeant Brown sat with Hans Becker in the small apartment above the stable. Despite the language barrier, the two men had developed a genuine connection through their shared love of horses. Becker had invited Brown to share his simple evening meal: dark bread, cheese, and a small portion of sausage that represented most of his weekly meat ration. Through a combination of gesture, the few German words Brown had learned and the few English words Becker knew, they managed a kind of conversation. Becker showed Brown photographs of his family: 2 sons both killed on the Eastern Front and a wife who had died during a bombing raid in 1943. Brown, in turn, shared pictures of his parents and 3 sisters back in Oklahoma. "Krieg, schlecht," Becker said, making a sweeping gesture meant to encompass the entire catastrophe of the war. "War, bad." Brown nodded solemnly. "Yeah, schlecht." Becker then pointed to Brown's sergeant insignia, then to himself, and made a marching motion while saying, 1914. He was trying to communicate that he had been a soldier himself in the First World War. Brown understood and asked, "France?" while pointing westward. Becker nodded vigorously. "Frankreich, ja, Verdun." The mention of Verdun, site of one of the most devastating battles in human history, created a moment of recognition. Though separated by language, race, nationality, and now opposing sides in the current war, both men shared the universal experience of soldiers: the fatigue, the fear, the loss, and the sense of being caught up in events beyond their control. Becker reached under his bed and produced a battered wooden box. Opening it reverently, he showed Brown his Iron Cross from the First World War alongside a faded photograph of his regiment. Brown studied the photo, noting how young Becker had been, not much older than Corporal Washington was now. In that moment, it struck him how cyclical warfare seemed, each generation fighting its version of the same conflicts. As the evening deepened into night, Becker poured 2 small glasses of schnapps. Raising his glass, he looked Brown directly in the eyes and said with careful pronunciation, "To peace." Brown clinked his glass against the German's. "To peace," he echoed. In her apartment several streets away, Helga Schmidt was putting Greta to bed. The girl's cough had improved significantly thanks to the American medicine, and she was chattering excitedly about her horse-riding experience. "Mutti, Herr Brown said if I practice, I can learn to ride by myself. Can I go again tomorrow?" Helga smoothed her daughter's hair. "We'll see, Liebling, the soldiers are very busy. They're not like the posters said," Greta observed with a child's directness. "The ones that Uncle Klaus showed us. Those were lies, weren't they?" Helga sighed, unsure how to explain the complexities of propaganda to an 8-year-old. "Yes, they were lies. Sometimes adults tell lies because they're afraid, or because they want others to be afraid. I'm not afraid of Herr Brown," Greta declared firmly. "He's nice. And he plays music on a little metal thing." "A harmonica," Helga supplied, remembering her brief childhood music lessons before the war consumed everything. "He said he'd teach me a cowboy song tomorrow," Greta continued, yawning. "About a home somewhere with deer and something else." "Antelope," came a voice from the doorway. Helga turned to see her father, Karl Weber, standing there. The elderly man had been listening quietly. "Opa," Greta exclaimed. "You know the song?" Karl nodded slowly. "I spent 2 years in America, in Texas, before the First War, learned to speak some English, worked on a ranch for a time." He hummed a few bars of Home on the Range. Helga stared at her father in surprise. He rarely spoke of his time in America, especially during the Nazi years when such connections were viewed with suspicion. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked after Greta had finally fallen asleep. Karl sank heavily into a chair. What was there to say? After the Treaty of Versailles, after the inflation, after everything. America became the enemy in people's minds. Then when Hitler came, he shrugged. It became dangerous to have such connections. And now? Helga asked quietly. Now I wonder what Germany might have been if we had not allowed ourselves to be filled with such hatred, Karl replied, his voice heavy with regret. I knew, Helga. Deep down, I knew the things they said about the Jews, about the Americans, about so many others. I knew they were lies. But I said nothing, did nothing. Helga took her father's weathered hand in hers. You protected us, Vater. What could you have done? Karl shook his head slowly. More than nothing. That much is certain. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Helga opened it to find Corporal Washington standing there with Private Steiner. Excuse the late hour, ma'am, Washington said politely while Steiner translated. The lieutenant asked me to inform you that we've established a school meal program starting tomorrow. All children will receive breakfast and lunch at the town hall. Your daughter is welcome to attend. Thank you, Helga replied. Please tell your lieutenant we are grateful. As the Americans turned to leave, Karl stepped forward. Young man, he said in rusty but understandable English. I was in Texas, 1912, San Antonio, good people there. Washington looked surprised, then smiled. Yes, sir, good people in Texas. My uncle lives in Dallas now. This simple exchange, a recognition of shared humanity across the artificial divides of conflict, seemed to affect Karl deeply. After the Americans left, he sat silently for a long time, lost in memories of a younger self in a distant land, before the world had been torn apart twice in his lifetime. The next morning dawned bright and clear. The improved weather allowed more extensive operations, including the arrival of additional troops and supplies. The main body of the 614th Battalion would remain in Remscheid for several more days, while frontline units pushed eastward toward Berlin. Lieutenant Wilson used the opportunity to implement a more comprehensive civil affairs program. Military government specialists wouldn't arrive for weeks, leaving the combat units to handle immediate civilian needs. Wilson established a formal structure for food distribution, medical care, and basic utilities repair, assigning specific soldiers to oversee each area based on their pre-war experiences. At the stable, Staff Sergeant Brown had organized a more formal riding instruction program with Hans Becker's assistance. What had begun as an impromptu activity was now a scheduled part of the day, with groups of children rotating through basic horsemanship lessons. Brown had recruited several other soldiers with rural backgrounds to help, creating a sort of impromptu black Cowboys demonstration that fascinated the German children and adults alike. In America, Brown explained through Steiner to an attentive group, many cowboys were black, like me. After the Civil War, when slavery ended, many freedmen found work on ranches in Texas and Oklahoma. This information visibly surprised the listeners. Nazi educational materials had portrayed American blacks as exclusively urban and unskilled, incapable of the independence and skill associated with cowboys. My grandfather was born a slave, Brown continued, his deep voice steady. He died a free rancher with his own land and horses. That's America at its best. The opportunity to become something new, something better. As he spoke, Brown helped a young boy mount the dappled mare. The child, initially nervous, beamed with pride as he sat tall in the saddle, hands positioned correctly on the reins as Brown had shown him. Gut gemacht, Brown praised in his limited German, patting the boy's leg encouragingly. Good job. Mayor Weber observed this scene from a distance, his academic's mind cataloguing the disconnect between Nazi racial theories and the reality before him. The supposed black devils were proving to be among the most humane liberators imaginable, disciplined, professional, and remarkably kind to civilians, especially children. When Captain Muller and Gestapo officer Kleinmann had delivered propaganda materials to Remscheid in March, they had specifically emphasized that black American troops would target children, not for kindness, but for cruelty. They will steal your children for slave labor in America, Mueller had claimed during a mandatory town meeting. Now, watching Brown patiently teach riding techniques with genuine care for safety and learning, Weber felt a deep shame at having facilitated the distribution of such obvious lies. As mayor, he had allowed his office to become a conduit for hatred and fear. The realization weighed heavily on him. Weber approached Lieutenant Wilson, who was supervising the distribution of supplemental rations to elderly residents nearby. "Lieutenant, may I speak with you privately?" Weber requested. Wilson nodded, instructing Corporal Washington to continue the distribution. He led Weber to a quieter area beside the church. "What can I do for you, Mayor?" Weber seemed to struggle with his words. "I wish to make amends, Lieutenant. The propaganda materials about your men, especially those concerning the black soldiers, I helped distribute them. I did not believe them, not entirely, but I distributed them nonetheless." Wilson studied the German thoughtfully. "Why tell me this now?" "Because seeing the truth has made the lie unbearable," Weber replied simply. "I have been complicit in a great wrong." Wilson considered his response carefully. As an officer, he wasn't supposed to engage in political discussions with local officials. That was for the military government teams that would follow. But as a black man watching the collapse of a regime built on racial hatred, he felt a profound significance in this moment. "Mayor Weber, acknowledging the wrong is the first step toward correcting it. What matters now is what you do going forward." "What can I do?" Weber asked, genuine anguish in his voice. "Help us rebuild not just your town, but its understanding of truth. Every time someone repeats those lies about my men, correct them. When someone expresses surprise that black soldiers aren't what propaganda claimed, remind them to question what else might have been false." Weber nodded slowly. "Yes, I can do this." "And," Wilson added, his voice taking on an edge of steel, "when our intelligence officers arrive to investigate Nazi party activities in Remscheid, tell them everything. Names, dates, actions. No more hiding, no more lies." Weber paled slightly but nodded again. "I understand. It will be difficult. There will be consequences." "Yes," Wilson agreed, "there will be. But Germany can't build something new without honestly confronting what it just did." As the day progressed, word reached Remscheid that American and Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from west and east. The war was entering its final phase. For the soldiers of the 614th, this news brought mixed emotions: elation that the fighting might soon end, anxiety about what would come next, and uncertainty about their place in the peace that would follow. At the orphanage, Doc Perkins had established a daily medical clinic with the assistance of Sister Margaret. The children's health was improving with regular meals and proper medicine, though years of deprivation had left many with chronic conditions that would require long-term care. Perkins had developed a particular concern for 3 children, the Jewish orphans Sister Margaret had protected. 10-year-old twins David and Rachel Goldstein and their 7-year-old cousin Sarah Klein had survived due to the nuns' courage and the fortunate timing of their parents' decision to send them away from Berlin in 1943. "The little ones don't remember much about their parents," Sister Margaret explained through Steiner. "But David and Rachel, they remember everything. Their father was a professor of mathematics, their mother a concert pianist." Perkins nodded, watching the children play with the other orphans in the yard. To casual observation, they were indistinguishable from their peers, German children playing German games, speaking German words. Yet under Nazi law, their very existence had been criminalized. "What will happen to them after the war?" Perkins asked. Sister Margaret sighed. "I do not know. We are trying to find relatives, perhaps in America or Palestine. But so many records are destroyed, so many families gone." "I'd like to help," Perkins said. "When I get home, I could contact Jewish relief organizations in America." Sister Margaret smiled. "You're a good man, Herr Doctor." "Not a doctor yet," Perkins corrected automatically, then added, "but I will be, God willing." The nun studied him curiously. "You have faith?" Perkins nodded. "Baptist. My father is a minister back in Virginia." "And yet you serve alongside men who would not worship with you in your own country," Sister Margaret observed. When Perkins looked startled, she added, "We had American visitors before the war. I know something of your countries. difficulties with race. Perkins considered this. It's complicated. America doesn't always live up to its ideals, neither did Germany. He gestured around them at the physical and social devastation that nationalist extremism had wrought. But I believe in those ideals even when others forget them. Freedom, equality, dignity, they're worth fighting for, even if the fight isn't over when this war ends. Sister Margaret reached out and touched his arm gently. Then we share the same faith, Herr Perkins, not just in God but in what people can be at their best. Back in town, Corporal Washington was supervising a group of German teenagers in clearing rubble from a bombed intersection. The work was part of Wilson's program to engage the civilian population in reconstruction efforts, providing purpose, promoting community cooperation, and beginning the physical rebuilding that would be necessary for years to come. The teens had been initially reluctant to take direction from a black soldier, but Washington's natural leadership and willingness to work alongside them quickly earned their respect. Now, several hours into the labor, a genuine camaraderie had developed. "Halt! Stop!" Washington called out, spotting something dangerous in the debris. "Everyone back!" The teens froze, then carefully retreated as Washington had trained them to do whenever something suspicious was found. In this case, it was the unmistakable tail fin of an unexploded incendiary bomb buried in the rubble. "Gott gemacht," Washington praised them, using one of the few German phrases he had mastered. "Very good, safety first." He radioed for the explosive ordnance disposal team, then used the opportunity to teach the teenagers more English while they waited at a safe distance. This impromptu language exchange had become a regular feature of their work sessions. "Debris," Washington said, pointing to the rubble. "Debris," the teens repeated in unison. "Dangerous," he continued, pointing to the partially exposed bomb. "Dangerous," they echoed. "Explosion," Washington said, using his hands to mimic a blast. "Explosion," came the response, accompanied by nervous laughter. One of the teenagers, a lanky boy named Friedrich, who had shown the most aptitude for English, asked hesitantly, "You... home where?" Washington smiled. "New York City. Harlem." The teens exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the name New York, but puzzled by Harlem. "Harlem is," Washington began, then realized how difficult it would be to explain the cultural and historical significance of his neighborhood through their limited shared vocabulary. Instead, he pulled out his wallet and showed them a photograph of 125th Street, with the Apollo Theater visible. "Harlem," he said again, pointing to the vibrant street scene. "Music, art, life." Friedrich studied the photo with evident fascination, then pointed to Washington and made a questioning gesture, asking if this was where he lived. Washington nodded. "Yes, my home." The simple exchange revealed more about Washington's identity than any propaganda could counter. To these German teenagers raised on images of black Americans as primitive and cultureless, the photograph of a sophisticated urban neighborhood contradicted everything they had been taught. After war, "You go back?" Friedrich asked. Washington nodded again. "Yes, college maybe, study engineering." This too visibly surprised the teens. The idea that a black man might pursue higher education, might become an engineer, represented yet another crack in the edifice of Nazi racial ideology. As the EOD team arrived to handle the unexploded ordnance, Washington gathered his young workers to move to another section of the street. He noticed they were watching him differently now, not with the initial wariness or the subsequent cautious acceptance, but with genuine curiosity and something approaching respect. At the town hall, Lieutenant Wilson was meeting with a newly arrived intelligence officer, Lieutenant David Cohen from the Counterintelligence Corps. Cohen, a Jewish American from Boston, had been assigned to investigate Nazi Party activities in Remscheid and identify individuals requiring arrest or detailed investigation. "Mayor Weber has been cooperative so far," Wilson explained, "but I recommend thorough verification of his statements. He admits to party membership, but claims it was professional necessity rather than ideological commitment." Cohen nodded, making notes. "That's what they all say now. We'll dig deeper." What about the Gestapo officer he mentioned, Kleinmann? Fled 2 days before we arrived, along with Captain Müller from Wehrmacht propaganda. Weber provided their known associates and possible destinations. That information has been forwarded to checkpoints, but no arrests reported yet. We'll find them, Cohen said with quiet determination, especially if he was Gestapo. Those bastards don't get to just disappear. He closed his notebook. What else should I know about this town? Wilson considered the question. The civilian population seems genuinely relieved the war is ending. Little resistance, increasing cooperation. The orphanage run by Sister Margareta Hoffman deserves special attention. She sheltered Jewish children throughout the war, at considerable personal risk. Cohen's expression softened slightly. I'll look into it. We need to document those who helped, as well as those who harmed. He paused, then added, The brass told me your men have been running some kind of cowboy show. Wilson couldn't help but smile. Staff Sergeant Brown has a way with horses. It started as community engagement and became something more. More? A living counter-propaganda, Wilson explained. These people were fed vicious lies about black Americans for years. Seeing my men as they truly are, skilled, compassionate, professional, is forcing a reckoning with those lies. Cohen looked thoughtful. Interesting approach. Not standard procedure, but I can see the value. He gathered his papers. I'll begin interviews tomorrow. Please have Mayor Weber and key officials available, and Lieutenant. Good work here. This is one of the more orderly situations I've encountered. After Cohen departed, Wilson checked his watch and realized it was nearly time for the afternoon supply distribution. The battalion had established a system whereby each neighborhood received allocations at staggered times, preventing the chaotic crowds that had characterized early relief efforts in other towns. As he walked toward the distribution point, Wilson passed the town square where Brown's informal riding school was in session. He paused to watch as Brown helped Greta Schmidt complete a full circuit of the square on her own, her face alight with accomplishment. On the sidelines, Helga Schmidt stood with a group of other mothers, their initial fears now transformed into appreciation for the patience and care shown to their children. Beside them, Hans Becker beamed like a proud grandfather as his horses performed their gentle duty with the young riders. The scene epitomized what Wilson had tried to explain to Lieutenant Cohen. This wasn't just community engagement or civilian control. It was a living refutation of hatred, more powerful than any counter-propaganda leaflets or denazification lectures could ever be. As Wilson continued toward the distribution point, he was intercepted by a breathless messenger from battalion headquarters. Sir, priority message from Captain Mills. German forces have been spotted approaching from the east, approximately company strength, moving on foot with light weapons. ETA 2 hours. Wilson immediately shifted to combat mode. Sound the alert. All personnel to defensive positions. Civilian curfew effective immediately. The peaceful interlude was over. The war, not yet finished, had returned to Remscheid. Within 30 minutes, the men of the 614th had secured key positions throughout the town. Roadblocks were established on eastern approaches, while civilians were directed to shelter in designated buildings with reinforced basements. The orphanage, particularly vulnerable on the town's eastern edge, received a full platoon for protection. At the stable, Staff Sergeant Brown quickly ended the riding lessons, sending the children home with urgent but calm instructions. Hans Becker helped move the horses to the most protected part of the stable, away from potential artillery or small arms fire. You should take shelter, Brown told Becker through Steiner. Town hall basement is safest. Becker shook his head firmly. 9, I stay with horses. Brown understood perfectly. Then we both stay, he decided. Private Steiner, tell the lieutenant I'm establishing an observation post here. The stable roof has good visibility of the eastern approach. As Steiner departed with the message, Brown and Becker worked quickly to prepare the stable. They moved hay away from potential fire sources, filled extra water buckets, and reinforced vulnerable windows with available materials. Throughout town, similar preparations were underway. Corporal Washington and his team of teenage workers had been in the middle of clearing the main intersection when the alert sounded. Now, instead of removing rubble, they were strategically repositioning it to create defensive barriers. You need to take shelter now, Washington told the teens. Go to the town hall, Schnell. Most of the teenagers complied immediately, but Friedrich hesitated. I can help, he offered in his limited English. Washington shook his head firmly. No, too dangerous. Go now. Friedrich reluctantly joined his peers, heading toward the designated shelter, leaving Washington and his squad to complete the defensive preparations alone. At the orphanage, Doc Perkins worked with Sister Margaret to move the children to the building's reinforced basement. The younger ones were told it was a game, while the older children understood the gravity of the situation all too well. Many had already survived multiple battles and bombing raids. Will they bomb us? 10-year-old David Goldstein asked Perkins directly, his eyes reflecting a weariness no child should possess. Perkins placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. We're here to protect you. The basement is safe, and our soldiers are outside. David seemed unconvinced. The soldiers always leave eventually. That's what happened in Berlin. The child's fatalism struck Perkins deeply. How many times had this boy been promised safety, only to be endangered again? Not this time, Perkins said with firm conviction. I promise you, David. Lieutenant Wilson established his command post in the town hall, coordinating communications between the various defensive positions and headquarters. Mayor Weber remained at his side, providing detailed information about the terrain and possible approaches the German forces might use. There's a ravine here, Weber pointed on the map, that provides covered movement almost to the eastern edge of town. The Wehrmacht used it for training exercises before the war. Wilson nodded, relaying this intelligence to his platoon leaders. Jackson, position 2 squads to cover that ravine approach. Brown, confirm visibility from your position. As preparations continued, an unexpected visitor arrived at the command post, Captain Muller, the Wehrmacht propaganda officer who had fled before the Americans arrived. He was in civilian clothes, limping heavily on his prosthetic leg, and had been brought in by an American patrol that found him approaching under a white flag. He says he wants to prevent unnecessary bloodshed, the patrol leader reported. Claims to have information about the German force heading this way. Wilson studied Muller with controlled hostility. This was the man who had spread vicious lies about black American soldiers, who had deliberately frightened women and children with fabricated atrocity stories. Translate for us, Wilson instructed Steiner, then addressed Müller directly. You have information. Müller spoke in rapid German, which Steiner translated. The approaching force is remnants of the 11th Panzer Division, approximately 120 men under Major Schneider. They are low on ammunition and food, exhausted from continuous retreat. They don't know Americans hold the town. They think it's still in German hands and are coming to rest and regroup. How do you know this? Wilson asked skeptically. I encountered their advance scout, Muller replied through Steiner. When I learned their intentions, I came to warn you. There can be an arrangement. Allow them to surrender honorably rather than walk into an ambush. Wilson considered this. If true, it could prevent a needless battle. But trusting Muller seemed risky. The man had made deception his profession. Why would you do this? Wilson asked. Why help us? Muller's expression hardened. Not helping you, helping them, and the civilians here. Enough have died for a lost cause. Wilson studied the German officer intently. Despite his distrust, he sensed genuine exhaustion and defeat in Muller, the look of a man who had finally accepted the reality of Germany's situation. If you're lying, Wilson said evenly, if this is a trick to give them a tactical advantage, you'll be held personally responsible for any American casualties. Muller nodded grimly. Understood. May I suggest a course of action? Wilson gestured for him to continue. Send me with a white flag to meet them before they reach town. Let me explain the situation and your terms for surrender. Schneider is a professional soldier, not SS. If offered honorable treatment, he will surrender rather than sacrifice his men pointlessly. After conferring with Captain Mills via radio, Wilson agreed to the plan with modifications. Muller would go under white flag, accompanied by an American officer and translator. If the Germans agreed to surrender, they would be directed to lay down weapons at a designated point outside town, then enter in organized groups for processing. Lieutenant Cohen from Counterintelligence volunteered to accompany Müller. As a Jewish officer, he had personal reasons to ensure the Germans surrendered, rather than fought. But he also understood the psychological impact his presence might have during negotiations. Seeing a Jewish American officer might help drive home the reality of their situation, Cohen explained. It's one thing to hear Germany has lost, another to face it directly. As Muller and Cohen departed under white flag, the men of the 614th remained at combat readiness. Wilson trusted neither Muller's intentions nor the unknown German commander's response. If the surrender negotiation failed, they needed to be prepared for immediate action. At the stable observation post, Staff Sergeant Brown and Hans Becker maintained their vigilance, watching the eastern approaches through binoculars. Their unlikely partnership, a black American cowboy and an elderly German horse trainer, epitomized the strange alliances that war sometimes created. "There," Becker said suddenly, pointing toward a distant tree line. "Bewegung." Movement. Brown followed his gesture, spotting the telltale signs of troops in the distance. "Good eyes," he complimented, immediately radioing the information to Wilson. "Confirmed movement, eastern approach approximately 2 kilometers out. Small groups advancing cautiously. White flag visible with lead element." Wilson acknowledged the report. "Hold positions. No firing unless directly ordered or threatened. Repeat to all units." Tense minutes passed as the situation developed. Through his binoculars, Brown could now see Muller, Cohen, and a tall German officer, presumed to be Major Schneider, engaged in conversation at the edge of the tree line. Several German soldiers stood at a respectful distance, weapons lowered, but not discarded. "What do you think they're saying?" Brown wondered aloud, forgetting momentarily that Becker wouldn't understand. To his surprise, Becker responded with a German phrase that, while unintelligible to Brown, clearly carried a tone of weary resignation. The universal language of gesture filled in the gaps. Becker pantomimed surrender, then pointed to his heart and made a crushing motion. The surrender might be happening, but it was breaking something fundamental in the German soldiers. Brown nodded in somber understanding. Though he had fought against these men, had seen friends killed by them, had suffered their prejudice both in propaganda and in the occasional captured German who refused to surrender to black troops, he could still recognize the human cost of defeat. Professional soldiers on both sides understood things that civilians and politicians often did not: the complex emotions of surrender, the strange respect that could exist between opponents, the shared experience of being pawns in larger games. After 20 minutes of discussion, the German soldiers began methodically stacking their weapons. Rifles, machine guns, and sidearms piled in organized fashion at the designated surrender point. The men then formed into ranks, maintaining military discipline even in defeat. Lieutenant Wilson dispatched units to secure the weapons and escort the prisoners into town in manageable groups. The surrender was proceeding peacefully. A small miracle in a war where final stage fanaticism had led to so much needless death. Corporal Washington's squad was assigned to guard the first group of 30 prisoners. As they approached the town, Washington noticed the Germans' expressions changing from resignation to confusion as they realized their guards were black soldiers. The propaganda about black devils clearly lingered in their minds, creating visible anxiety among some of the younger prisoners. "Ruhig bleiben," Washington said in his limited German. "Stay calm." Then, switching to English that few would understand, but his tone conveying the message, "Nobody's going to hurt you if you follow instructions. This isn't what they told you it would be." The prisoners were directed to the town's school building, which had been quickly converted into a temporary holding facility. There they would receive medical attention if needed, basic rations, and processing by intelligence officers interested in their knowledge of remaining German forces. As the first group was settled, Wilson received word that Major Schneider requested to address his men one final time before being separated for officer-specific interrogation. After consulting with Lieutenant Cohen, Wilson approved the request with appropriate security precautions. Schneider, a tall, gaunt man with the hollow-eyed look of someone who had been retreating too long on too little food and sleep, stood before his assembled troops in the school gymnasium. His bearing remained proud despite the circumstances, his uniform worn but meticulously maintained. "Men of the 11th Panzer," he began in German, with Steiner providing quiet translation for the American officers present. "You have fought with courage and honor in circumstances few could endure. The war is lost, but your dignity remains intact." He paused, surveying the faces before him. Some young boys barely old enough to shave, others veterans of multiple campaigns, all showing the physical and psychological toll of Germany's collapse. "We surrender not to escape our duty, but to fulfill our final obligation to Germany, to survive and help rebuild our homeland from the ashes of this catastrophe. Remember who you are, maintain your discipline, and cooperate fully with the American authorities." His gaze swept across the American officers present, lingering momentarily on Wilson and Washington. "I am told you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, with proper respect as prisoners of war. I have received personal assurances of this from the American command." With that, Schneider offered a formal salute to his men, then allowed himself to be escorted to separate quarters for officer processing. As the surrender was completed and security arrangements for the prisoners finalized, the immediate crisis passed. Wilson ordered a reduction in alert status while maintaining appropriate guard rotations. Civilians were permitted to leave their shelters, returning to the strange new normal of occupation that they had been adapting to before the interruption. By evening, the situation had stabilized completely. The German prisoners were documented, fed, and secured. Preliminary interrogations revealed that they had indeed been unaware of American presence in Remscheid, expecting it to be a temporary haven during their long retreat westward. Rather than the defeat they had feared, the surrender had been almost a relief, an end to weeks of increasingly desperate movement with dwindling supplies and no strategic purpose. At the orphanage, Doc Perkins and Sister Margaret brought the children up from the basement. The older ones understood what had happened. More German soldiers had surrendered, bringing the war another small step closer to its inevitable conclusion. "Will they stay here?" David Goldstein asked, watching from the window as prisoners were marched past. "No," Perkins explained. "They'll be moved to larger camps soon." David nodded solemnly. "Good. I don't want them here." The boy's simple statement carried the weight of immeasurable trauma. For children like David, uniformed German soldiers represented an existential threat, regardless of individual actions or intentions. No explanation of "not all Germans" could erase what they had experienced and lost. Sister Margaret placed a gentle hand on David's shoulder. "They cannot hurt you now," she assured him. "It is ending at last." In the stable, Staff Sergeant Brown and Hans Becker climbed down from their observation post. The immediate need for vigilance passed. The horses, sensitive to the tension, had remained unsettled throughout the alert, but now began to calm as the men resumed normal care routines. "Alles gut," Becker said, patting Brown's shoulder. "All good?" Brown nodded, understanding perfectly. "Yeah, alles gut." As they worked, Becker seemed lost in thought. Finally, through gestures and his limited English, he conveyed a question about what would happen next, to Remscheid, to Germany, to the relationship between their countries. Brown wished he had an answer. The political future remained as uncertain as his own personal one. Would America acknowledge what black soldiers had done in this war? Would it translate to changes back home? Would the Germans learn from their catastrophic embrace of hatred, or would new forms emerge? Unable to articulate these complexities across the language barrier, Brown simply shrugged and said, "We rebuild, start again." Becker seemed to understand the deeper meaning. "Ja," he agreed. "Neu anfangen." New beginning. Lieutenant Wilson spent the evening completing paperwork related to the prisoner intake. The administrative burden of modern warfare sometimes seemed as heavy as the combat itself, each action generating reports, each decision requiring documentation, each prisoner creating files that would follow them through the system. Captain Mills arrived shortly before midnight to review the situation. "Clean operation, Wilson," he commented, scanning the neatly organized prisoner manifest. "No casualties on either side. Excellent outcome." "Thank you, sir. Intelligence is pleased with the haul. Schneider apparently has useful knowledge of remaining units in the region." Mills closed the folder. "Headquarters says Berlin will fall within days. This thing is finally ending." Wilson nodded, feeling the weight of near victory. What happens to my men when it's over, sir? Mills understood the subtext of the question. Occupation duty, most likely. Then home, eventually. He hesitated, then added, What happens when they get there? That's the next battle, isn't it? Yes, sir, that's the one I'm worried about. Mills studied his subordinate thoughtfully. For what it's worth, Wilson, I'll be writing commendations for your entire platoon. What they've accomplished here, not just the tactical objectives, but how they've done it, deserves recognition. I appreciate that, sir, but will anyone back home care? Some will. Not everyone, not right away, but enough to matter. Mills stood to leave. Get some rest, Lieutenant. Tomorrow we'll be busy. The next morning brought news that Soviet forces had reached Berlin's outskirts, while Allied troops consolidated positions throughout Western Germany. The Third Reich was in its final days, Hitler reportedly hiding in a bunker beneath the shattered capital. For the men of the 614th, the approaching end brought mixed emotions: relief that the killing might soon stop, pride in their role, anxiety about what peace would bring. At the stable, the regular routine of Brown's riding lessons resumed, though with heightened security due to the prisoner presence. The German children, after brief uncertainty, returned eagerly to their new American friends. For them, the arrival of additional German soldiers and their subsequent surrender was just another incomprehensible adult event in a world that had never made much sense to begin with. Greta Schmidt had progressed remarkably in her riding skills. Under Brown's patient instruction, she could now confidently control the mare at walking pace without assistance, making full circuits of the stable yard while maintaining proper posture and rein control. You're a natural, Miss Greta, Brown told her through Steiner's translation. Back home, we'd say you were born in the saddle. When this was translated, Greta beamed with pride. Will I get to ride in America someday? The innocent question caught Brown off guard. Maybe so, he answered carefully. America's a big place with lots of horses. Mutti says perhaps we can go there after the war, Greta continued. She says Germany is, she searched for the right word, kaputt. Brown couldn't argue with that assessment. Germany was indeed kaputt, physically devastated, economically ruined, socially traumatized, and morally compromised by its embrace of hatred and violence. Yet in the interactions between former enemies, in the simple act of a black American soldier teaching German children to ride horses, something new was emerging from the ruins. Germany will rebuild, Brown said simply, and maybe you'll visit America someday. 5 days later, news reached Remscheid that Berlin had fallen and Hitler was dead. The war in Europe was effectively over, though formal surrender documents remained to be signed. For the men of the 614th, the victory felt surreal after months of constant combat. Lieutenant Wilson gathered his platoon for a brief ceremony, acknowledging what they had accomplished together. Gentlemen, you've served with distinction under circumstances few can imagine. Remember what you did here, not just as soldiers, but as ambassadors of what America should be. In the weeks that followed, as occupation duties normalized, the connections formed in Remscheid deepened. Brown's riding school became a formal part of the town's recovery program, providing structure and joy for children traumatized by war. Doc Perkins secured support from American Jewish organizations for the orphans Sister Margaret's had protected. Corporal Washington's English lessons expanded to include adults eager to communicate with their occupiers and perhaps someday visit America. When transfer orders finally came in June 1945, the departure of the 614th from Remscheid was marked by genuine sorrow on both sides. At the stable, Hans Becker presented Brown with his cherished Iron Cross from the First War. For a true soldier, he said through Steiner, who taught us humanity when we had forgotten it. Helga and Greta Schmidt stood among the crowd as the American convoy prepared to depart. We will remember, Helga said simply to Lieutenant Wilson. What was true, what was false, we know now. Years later, in 1952, Staff Sergeant Thomas Jefferson Brown, now operating a successful ranch in Oklahoma, received an unexpected letter from Germany. Inside was a photograph of a teenage Greta Schmidt, astride a magnificent Trakehner stallion, competing in a regional equestrian event. The accompanying note read simply, "You taught me more than riding. You taught me truth." The propaganda that had once warned German women that black devils will chain you had been permanently shattered by the reality of black American soldiers who instead had helped them mount horses, shared their food, treated their sick, and shown the dignity their own leaders had abandoned. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.